قسوة فإذا عن القرآن حين
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our series, Reflections on the Qur'an. We're talking about the story of Musa and Firawn and the lessons that it has for us in a modern civilization. That story of Musa and Firawn takes place at the dawn of civilization. Egypt is considered to be one of the cradles of human civilization, a place where you first see centralized governments, where you see written history developing through the invention of writing. You see hierarchical societies where some people are richer than others, there are social classes, and you see differentiation within the society, that people do different things to make a living, and that's very different from your quote-unquote primitive societies. And so we're looking at the Fir'aunic system that's outlined in the Qur'an. We mentioned that the parties that he relied upon for support in order to maintain his system, and that he called upon to oppose the message of Musa alayhi salam, included his nobles, his army, his chief minister, the wealthy businessman Qarun, and the magicians. So we're starting to talk about the magicians and their role in this whole process. So when Musa first was challenged by Firawn, he's come to the court, he's delivered the message, and Firawn is rejecting it. And so the first response is, if you got something, bring it. Give me some sign that you're not just an ordinary human being. So when he threw down that stick and it turned into a snake, suddenly there's concern here. Uh-oh, this is a threat. So his nobles, he consults with them, and in fact, his immediate reaction is, you know what, this is sorcery, and we have sorcery. We'll bring a sorcery to match your sorcery. And they appoint a day where there's going to be this contest, and then everybody is called to also attend. And in the course of those invitations, the people are being invited to follow the sorcerers in case they win. And when Firawn sends out his messengers to find all the skillful sorcerers in the land, they come to him and they say, are we going to get paid for this? The first and most important question that needs to be settled before we get down to business, are we going to get paid? And he says, of course. And in fact, you'll be part of the inner circle. And so then when they come to the day, and the sorcerers, they ask Musa, you want to throw first, or you want us to throw first? And he says, go ahead, you throw. And so what they do is they start to throw down those sticks and those ropes. Is they say, bi'izzati Firawn. They invoke the honor, the majesty, the dignity of Firawn. By the majesty of Firawn, we will be victorious. And so anything they do, any success they have is only a reflection of Firawn. So their action is a key component of Firawn's policy of how to maintain a grip on power. Now, when they throw those ropes and sticks down on the ground, it mentions that due to their sorcery, they made it look like these things were moving. And it was so real in appearance that Musa was inwardly alarmed. And he is the one who has Allah with him to the utmost. So what about your average people? Now, I cannot vouch for the authenticity of what I'm about to tell you, but I had a roommate in college who was telling me about how he had transferred from another college where there was a it was a really far out school, and one of the things that they studied, a class that he took had something to do with extrasensory perception, and so they got into hypnotism, and they got into sleight of hand and magic. And so he told me that I don't know if he saw the film or if it was described to him, but what happened was that they brought these scientists in America. I don't know if they came to India or if they brought these guys from India to America, but these guys were magicians, and they did this trick, this is called the Indian rope trick, where the man pulls a rope out of a basket, and he just sort of pulls it up, and then it's kind of like a pole that's erected into the air, and then he climbs up it. And, it's just a rope, but he's up about 10 feet above the ground. And so they asked these guys to do that trick, and there were people around, and they were watching it, and they were also filming it. And so what all the live audience saw was that these guys put that rope up in the air, and then they climbed up it. And what the camera saw was that they did something, they moved their hands, and then they lay down on the ground and out of sight, and the rest of what the people saw was some kind of a projection. Now, I don't know if that's accurate or not, if that really happened. Anyway, but what those magicians were doing in the time of Firawn was something like that. And they were making people see something that was not there. And in Surah Al-A'raf, when this same story is told, it gives one more twist to that function of the magicians. They ask Musa, you want to throw first? He said, no, you go ahead. قَالَ أَلْقُوا فَلَمَّا أَلْقَوْا سَحَرُوا أَعْيُنَ النَّاسِ وَاسْتَرْهَبُوهُمْ وَجَاءُوا بِسِحْرٍ عَظِيمٍ. It says, when they threw, they cast a spell on people's eyes, striking fear into them and bringing about great sorcery. So what this verse is saying is that what the magicians were doing, they did two things. They made people see what was not there, and they made them afraid. And so if we look at modern societies and how they maintain control over their population, we see these same groups that are mentioned in the Quranic detailing of the Fir'aunic system. We see counterparts to them in modern societies. Obviously, your modern rulers are not claiming to be divine. The last ruler that claimed divinity, ruler of a major country, was the Emperor of Japan. In the Japanese Constitution of 1899, the Constitution said that, yeah, this man is descended from the sun goddess. And that was, enshrined in the Constitution. And then when Japan was defeated in World War II, in order for Hirohito to avoid being tried as a war criminal, he had to come out in front of the public and say, you know what, I'm really not descended from anybody, any kind of a goddess. I'm just a man like the rest of you. And so that was the last human, or the last modern person who was claiming to be divine. Now, if we look at Qarun and his relation to Firawn, Firawn was on top, and Qarun was just one of the circle that was deriving benefit from their subservience to Firawn and their closeness to him. If we look at the modern age, the counterparts of Qarun, the fabulously wealthy, you can make a case, a very strong case, that they're the ones who are calling the shots. Those guys who are there and apparently being elected and apparently making decisions, there's a lot of evidence to say that those guys are just following orders. And if we look at, the history of the modern world, you here in India, India was the first country to be conquered by a corporation. The British East India Company conquered a whole country. And one of the interesting things about that is that they didn't do it with British soldiers. Yes, there were some, but the vast majority of the soldiers that the British used to conquer India were Indian soldiers. And another interesting thing about the British East India Company was that The American Revolution started with an act of terrorism against the British East India Company. They were given a monopoly to sell tea in the New World. Before that, the settlers in the New World, the colonists, they had ships, and they used to go to China and get tea and bring it back and sell it. But at some point, the British East India Company said, you know, they're cutting into our profits. And so the king gave an order that nobody can sell tea in the colonies of the new land, the New World, unless it's the British East India Company. And so that was the actual spark that lit the fire of the American Revolution. Now, if you look at the financial meltdown of 2008, what did we see there? We saw these private banks that are considered too big to fail, and their representatives in the governments jumped to alert, jumped to attention, and immediately began pouring trillions, something like 16 trillion US dollars of money into those banks so that they would not collapse. And so if you or I were in trouble, would we be able to get that kind of a handout from the government? Most definitely not. So who's running those governments? Let's take a break and we'll be back, inshallah.
We are not addicted to dawah. Addiction implies a short-term fix. One doesn't need to get into the zone to talk about Islam. You do dawah because it is a natural result of your commitment to Allah. If you don't talk, people are going to walk. The most effective combination in the propagation of true Islam is found in Dawah ilallah. Join me, Arif Islam, as we go through Dawah ilallah only on Peace TV.
Follow the tips to make the task of Dawah result-oriented in Dawah ilallah tomorrow at 11:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 6 a.m. UK on Peace TV. Distinguished world-famous orator who dedicated their lives to convey the message of peace came together at one platform, the International Islamic Conference, with one vision, with one mission, Peace Mission.
I welcome all of you with Islamic greetings. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Peace Mission, next on Peace TV.
Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. We're talking about counterparts in the modern time to the pharaonic system, and we said that Qarun, who was fabulously wealthy, he was subservient to Firawn. In the modern era, it looks like Qarun is actually running the show. If we look and see the existence of large standing armies that monopolize the use of force for centralized states, of course we have the same thing. We see elites who consult in order to decide policies for countries. That remains the same. We also, in addition to armies, we see this huge expansion of intelligence agencies. They're closely linked with the military, but their function is kind of different. They gather information, and they also undertake covert actions. Armies wage open wars, and intelligence agencies wage secret wars. And usually it's not wars on a large scale, it's usually events. And then we see who are the modern magicians. My analysis, what magicians did for the Fir'aunic system was to legitimize the ruler by making people see things that weren't really there, in order distorting people's perception of reality, and making people afraid. So there are 4 major manifestations that you can see of this in the modern world. One is public relations firms. So like the Rockefellers, they hired somebody to make them look good after there were some coal miners who were striking at a mine that they owned in Colorado early in the 20th century, and they called in the National Guard, and they killed 20 or so of those miners and their women and children. And that caused actually a war to break out in Colorado, which required the army to come in to crush it. So everybody was talking about how bad the Rockefellers were because it was their mine, and they wouldn't give these workers who were working for almost nothing the kind of requests that they were making for living wages. And so they brought in a guy who had a background in journalism in order to give a spin to all of those stories. Now, his mistake was that he was out there talking, and so he also became a focus of attention, and people began attacking him. Now, modern public relations firms don't make that mistake. They learn from him. So, for instance, when Kuwait was invaded, they hired Hill and Knowlton, the #1 public relations firm in the world, to represent them in order to build public opinion that America should invade Kuwait in order to throw out Saddam Hussein. And Hill and Knowlton created some kind of front organization that was like Committee for a Free Kuwait, and they brought in the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S., and they coached her. They gave her this completely made-up story about Iraqi soldiers coming into the hospital in Kuwait and seizing the incubators, and there were premature babies that were in the incubators, and they threw them to the floor and pulled out all the needles and stuff and left them to die on the cold, hard floor. And they had her testify in front of a bunch of people who were actually members of Congress. But the situation in which she testified was not actually a congressional meeting. It was held outside of Congress, and it wasn't an official piece of congressional business, which was lucky for her because she was telling a lie, and that's a criminal offense in front of a congressional committee. So she did it in something that looked like a congressional committee, but it wasn't. And Hill and Knowlton should have registered, according to U.S. law, as an agent of a foreign government. They didn't, and nobody said anything because the U.S. government wanted to build public support for an invasion of Kuwait. So their interests coincided, and so there were no legal repercussions to their breaking the law. Another angle of, who are the magicians in our modern time? Who tells people things which are not accurate in order to make them accept that the way things are the way they should be? Academic experts. And one of the prime examples of that is economists. They're the #1 field of academic expertise that rulers listen to. And the ones who had the rulers' ears leading up to the 2008 crisis didn't have a clue that there was a crisis coming. But they were making these arrogant statements like, there's only one set of rules for economics. It's like physics, and the same rules apply everywhere. Well, if you are such an expert in how economics works, how come you didn't see this thing coming? And there's an important little footnote to that. There's a Nobel Prize for economics that was not endowed by Nobel himself. They call it a Nobel Prize for economics, but it was only instituted, I think, in the 1960s, and the money is not coming from Nobel and his legacy. It's coming from the Central Bank of Sweden, which is a private bank, and the kind of people that they choose to win that award are the economists that are saying what they want to hear. And so being given that award gives these people legitimacy so that, oh, he's one of the smartest economists in the world. What he's saying must be right. So that's academic expert. You also have the corruption of academic research by corporations. They hire university professors to do research. Famous example of this is drug companies. Research that will support the sale of their drug. Eventually, I guess all that comes out. لِكُلِّ نَبَإٍ مُسْتَقَرٌ وَسَوْفَ تَعْلَمُونَ. Allah says that for every piece of news, there's a final disposition, and eventually you'll come to know. So the process of science will eventually weed out that kind of research. But in the short term, these corporations are getting short-term benefits for the contributions of these academic experts. And corporations, basically, they're not thinking about long-term anyway. It's all short-term benefit. Another example of this distortion of facts is what's called false flag operations by intelligence agencies. It's common consensus. Virtually everybody knows that President Kennedy was not assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. There was an official story that was produced in order to find a patsy, somebody who would look like, yeah, you know, he was the bad guy, he did it. When they set up these kind of operations, they find somebody who, before they do it, they decide who's going to be the fall guy. And then they plant evidence to make him look guilty. And when that first plan really didn't work, you know, the public didn't buy that Oswald was the assassin, or if he was, that he was acting alone. And so 10, 12 years later, the House of Representatives in the U.S., they set up a new committee to reinvestigate. And they agreed that, yeah, there was a conspiracy, but it was on the part of the mafia. So once again, the American intelligence agencies were, the suspicion was deflected from them. Now, there's an example of that, the Lavon affair. Israel, they wanted to discredit the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 1954. They sent agents in to bomb American, British, French interests in Egypt and to try to make it look like the Muslim Brotherhood was behind those bombings. Their agents were incompetent and they were captured by the Egyptian government. And it became a great embarrassment to the Israeli government, but that's long forgotten. But these kind of events keep cropping up, and alert observers should be aware of it. You know, don't be taken in that all of these things that on the surface look like somebody's doing them, they're not always done by the parties that are being identified in the media. And that brings us to the most important of these magicians, which is the modern media. And there's interlocking directorates between media corporations and the corporations of Wall Street. And so their activities reflect the interests of, I mean, they share the same interests. And there's also, like in the US, there was Operation Mockingbird, which was set up in the 1950s, which was cooperation between the CIA and the leading American media outlets like the New York Times, CBS News, Time and Life magazines, the Washington Post. They were all thick as thieves. Now, one of the threats to media dominance or monopoly control of what it is that people understand of the news is that you have the internet. And it's not expensive to gather, analyze, and distribute news in this time due to the technological innovation of the internet. And that's why you see these security agencies, these intelligence agencies, making it their priority to know what every single person on the internet is saying and putting out there. And one of the things that they're also trying to do is to be able to block sites or arrest people in the name of intellectual property rights, that this person is somehow using somebody else's intellectual property, and they want to make that a criminal offense in order to have a weapon to use against those whom they consider to be a threat to them. Now, all of that is gathering steam. You know, the initial effect of the internet upon human societies was to democratize them. And so now there's a serious pushback on the part of the powers that be. We've run out of time, and that's the end of the series too. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.
اقرأ أخيا ورتل القرآن اصدح بصوتك اسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا